Marcus Wellington III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard where he controlled every piece. At 38, he commanded a business empire worth $12 billion, built from the tech company his grandfather had started as a small electronics repair shop. The Wellington name was synonymous with innovation, ruthlessness, and an iron-fisted control that extended far beyond corporate boardrooms. His mansion in the hills overlooked the city like a modern castle, its stark white walls and geometric lines reflecting his personality, cold, calculated, and impenetrable. The estate sprawled across 15 acres, complete with tennis courts, an Olympic-sized pool, and gardens maintained by a team of landscapers who worked only when Marcus wasn't home. Every detail was controlled, every aspect managed to his exacting standards. The one rule that governed his personal sanctuary was absolute. No children were ever allowed on the property. Not the children of employees, not the offspring of business partners, not even his own sister's kids during family gatherings. The meetings happened at restaurants, hotels, anywhere but his home. His staff knew this rule as well as they knew their own names, and it had never been questioned in the 8 years since he'd purchased the estate. Marcus had his reasons he'd never shared with anyone. The silence of his home was sacred to him, a necessity born from a childhood spent in chaos. Growing up as the heir to the Wellington fortune meant boarding schools, nannies who quit without notice, and parents who treated him more like a future CEO than a son. The constant noise, the unpredictability of children, the mess they created, it all reminded him of everything he'd worked to escape. His current household staff consisted of exactly 7 people, each carefully vetted and trained to maintain the pristine silence he demanded. There was Roberts, his personal butler who had worked for the family for 20 years, Chun, the head chef who prepared meals that looked like art, 3 housekeepers who worked different shifts to ensure the mansion was always spotless, a groundskeeper who doubled as security, and his personal assistant, Sarah, who managed his schedule with military precision. The newest addition to his staff had been hired 3 weeks ago, though Marcus had barely noticed the change. His previous housekeeper had retired, and Sarah had handled the replacement process entirely. All he knew was that the new hire came with excellent references and had passed the extensive background check required for all his employees. The house continued to run smoothly. His clothes appeared cleaned and pressed, and his meals arrived on time. That was all that mattered to him. What Marcus didn't know was that his new housekeeper, Elena Rodriguez, was a 34-year-old single mother of twins. She had been working double shifts at 2 different cleaning services before landing this position, desperately trying to support her 6-year-old children, Sophia and Miguel. Elena's interview had been conducted by Sarah and the head of human resources at Wellington Industries, and while they had asked about her availability for extended hours, no one had specifically mentioned the no-children policy. Elena had assumed it was understood that her children would never come to her workplace. She had arranged for them to stay with her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who watched several children in the building for working mothers. It was an arrangement that had worked perfectly for 3 weeks, allowing Elena to focus entirely on her job and earn the steady income her family desperately needed. The mansion had become a different world for Elena, a place where she could disappear into the rhythm of work and forget about the constant stress of bills and uncertainty. The pay was more than double what she'd earned at her previous jobs, and, for the first time in years, she could afford to buy her children new clothes instead of relying on hand-me-downs from the church donation box. Marcus maintained his routine with clockwork precision. Every morning at 6:30, he would emerge from his master suite dressed for his workout. He would spend exactly 45 minutes in his private gym, shower, and appear in the dining room at 8 o'clock for breakfast. He would review financial reports while eating, take calls from his driver on the way to the office, and return home no earlier than 8 in the evening. Weekends followed a similar pattern, with slightly later start times and longer periods spent in his home office. Elena learned his schedule quickly and adapted her work to avoid any unnecessary interactions. She would clean the areas he'd used after he left them, maintain the spaces he would need before he arrived, and remain essentially invisible throughout his day. It was a delicate dance that required precision and attention to detail, but Elena had always been good at making herself useful without being noticed. The mansion's security system was state-of-the-art, with cameras monitoring every entrance and sensors that detected any unauthorized movement. Marcus could observe every corner of his property from his phone, and he often did, especially during the evening hours when he wanted to ensure his privacy was maintained. The system also tracked when staff members arrived and departed, creating a detailed log that Sarah reviewed weekly. On a Thursday evening in early November, Marcus was reviewing quarterly projections in his study when he noticed something unusual on the security feed. A small figure was visible near the service entrance, but the image was too unclear to make out details. He switched to a different camera angle and increased the zoom, but whatever he'd seen seemed to have moved out of range. He made a mental note to have the system checked for glitches and returned to his reports. What Marcus had glimpsed was actually Sofia Rodriguez, Elena's daughter, who had wandered away from Mrs. Chin's apartment and somehow found her way to the mansion. At 6 years old, Sofia was curious about everything, especially where her mother spent most of her time. She had seen Elena leave for work and decided to follow the bus route, getting off at what she thought was the right stop. The mansion's imposing gates had caught her attention, and she had somehow slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence that the groundskeeper hadn't noticed. Elena was working in the east wing of the mansion, completely unaware that her daughter was exploring the property. Sofia wandered through the gardens, fascinated by the fountain and the perfectly manicured hedges. She had never seen anything so beautiful and grand, and she couldn't understand why her mother seemed so tired and stressed when she worked in such a magical place. As evening turned to night, Sofia began to feel scared and cold. She tried to retrace her steps, but became confused by the mansion's size and the darkness that had settled over the grounds. She found a small alcove near the pool house and curled up in the shadows, hoping her mother would find her soon. Meanwhile, Elena had finished her evening tasks and was preparing to leave when she received a frantic call from Mrs. Chun. Sofia was missing, and the elderly woman was beside herself with worry. Elena's heart stopped as she listened to the explanation of how Sofia had slipped away while Mrs. Chun was helping another child with homework. Elena's first instinct was to leave immediately and join the search for her daughter, but a terrible thought occurred to her. What if Sofia had somehow found her way to the mansion? It seemed impossible, but Elena knew her daughter's curiosity and determination. Sofia had asked many questions about Elena's new job, wanting to know why her mother couldn't take her to work like some of the other mothers in their building. Fighting panic, Elena called Mrs. Chun back and asked her to contact the police while Elena checked the mansion grounds. She knew she was risking her job, but finding Sofia was the only thing that mattered. Using her key card, she accessed the security system and began checking the outdoor cameras, scanning for any sign of a small figure. The mansion's extensive security network included motion sensors throughout the property, and Elena noticed that there had been several unexplained alerts near the pool area earlier in the evening. Her heart pounding, she made her way outside and began searching the shadows, calling Sofia's name in a whisper. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made the city look sharp and clean from Marcus's bedroom windows. He followed his usual routine, but something felt different as he moved through his morning workout. There was an odd sense that his perfect order had been slightly disturbed, though he couldn't put his finger on what exactly had changed. Elena arrived at work 30 minutes early, her nerves still frayed from the previous night's scare. She had barely slept, holding Sofia close and wondering if she should quit her job rather than risk another incident. But the reality of her situation made that choice impossible. This job was the best opportunity she'd had in years, and her children depended on the income it provided. She threw herself into her work with even more intensity than usual, as if perfect performance could somehow protect her from discovery. Every surface gleamed, every room was arranged exactly as Marcus preferred, and she moved through her tasks with the efficiency of someone who understood that her livelihood hung by a thread. Marcus noticed the extra attention to detail that morning, though he attributed it to Elena finally settling into the rhythm of her job. His breakfast was perfectly prepared, his study had been cleaned to an almost obsessive standard, and Even the flowers in the entry hall seemed more artfully arranged than usual. He found himself oddly pleased by the improvement, though he would never think to compliment his staff directly. What Marcus didn't notice was the small, muddy footprint that Elena had missed near the pool house, or the tiny handprint on the glass door that led to the garden. These traces of Sophia's midnight adventure remained like breadcrumbs, waiting to reveal the secret that Elena was desperately trying to keep. Meanwhile, Sophia was recovering from her adventure at Mrs. Chin's apartment, regaling the elderly woman and her twin brother Miguel with stories of the magical castle where their mother worked. Sophia's imagination had transformed the mansion into something from a fairy tale, complete with fountains that sang and gardens where flowers glowed in the moonlight. Miguel listened to his sister's stories with the skeptical air of a 6-year-old who considered himself far too practical for such nonsense. But even he was intrigued by Sophia's descriptions of the enormous house with rooms bigger than their entire apartment. He began to wonder if their mother really worked in such a place, or if Sophia's active imagination had created the whole thing. Mrs. Chun, who had been caring for neighborhood children for 30 years, recognized the signs of a child who had seen something remarkable. Sophia's descriptions were too detailed, too specific to be entirely fabricated. She began to worry that Elena might be working in a situation that could put her job at risk, especially if her children's curiosity led them into trouble again. Elena's anxiety about the situation reached a breaking point when Mrs. Chen called her during her lunch break. The elderly woman gently explained that Sophia had been asking increasingly specific questions about the mansion, and that Miguel was now showing interest in visiting his mother's workplace. Mrs. Chun suggested that Elena might need to have a serious conversation with her children about boundaries and safety. The call left Elena shaking as she stood in the mansion's kitchen, surrounded by luxury that felt more oppressive than beautiful. She realized that she was living in two completely separate worlds, the desperate, day-to-day struggle of her real life, and the pristine, controlled environment where she earned the money to survive. The distance between these worlds was becoming harder to maintain. That afternoon, Marcus had an unusual break in his schedule when a conference call was canceled at the last minute. Instead of filling the time with another meeting, he decided to walk through his house, something he rarely did during daylight hours. He moved from room to room with the eye of someone inspecting a valuable asset, noting details, and checking that everything met his exacting standards. It was in his study that he first noticed something amiss. A small smudge on the window that looked out over the pool area caught his attention. Elena had cleaned these windows just that morning, and she was meticulous about such details. Marcus examined the mark more closely and realized it was a handprint, a very small handprint at child height. His first reaction was anger. Someone had violated the sanctity of his home, allowed a child onto his property despite his clear rules. But as he studied the print more carefully, confusion replaced fury. The print was fresh, certainly made within the last day or two. None of his staff had mentioned any visitors, and his security system would have recorded any unauthorized entry. Marcus pulled up the security footage on his phone, scanning through the previous evening's recordings. What he saw made his blood run cold. A small figure moving through his gardens, clearly a child exploring the property with the fearless curiosity of youth. The image quality made it impossible to identify the intruder, but there was no question that someone had breached his sanctuary. His immediate instinct was to call Roberts and demand an explanation, but something made him pause. The child in the footage didn't appear to be vandalizing or stealing. They seemed almost lost, wandering aimlessly before disappearing near the pool house. There was something oddly heartbreaking about the solitary figure moving through the vast, empty grounds. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon in an unusual state of distraction. His mind kept returning to the image of the child exploring his property, and he found himself wondering who they were and how they had managed to slip past his security measures. The violation of his privacy should have enraged him, but instead, he felt a strange curiosity that he couldn't explain. Elena finished her shift that evening in a state of nervous exhaustion. She had spent the day waiting for Marcus to discover some evidence of Sophia's presence, expecting at any moment to be called into his study and fired on the spot. When 6 o'clock arrived without incident, she allowed herself to hope that she had successfully covered their tracks. As she prepared to leave, Elena made one final check of the areas where Sophia had been. She wiped down every surface one more time, vacuumed the carpets again, and ensured that no trace remained of her daughter's adventure. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice Marcus watching her from the doorway of his study. Marcus had positioned himself where he could observe Elena's departure routine, curious to see if her behavior would reveal anything about the mysterious child visitor. What he saw puzzled him. Elena was clearly agitated about something, cleaning areas that were already spotless with an intensity that suggested fear rather than dedication. When Elena finally left that evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of confronting her immediately or firing her outright, he decided to investigate further. There was something about the situation that didn't add up, and Marcus had built his fortune on his ability to solve complex puzzles. He spent the evening reviewing personnel files, looking for any detail that might explain what had happened. Elena's file was surprisingly thin, a few references from previous employers, a background check that revealed nothing concerning, and basic contact information. What struck him was how little he actually knew about any of his staff members beyond their professional qualifications. The realization made Marcus uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite define. He prided himself on his attention to detail, his control over every aspect of his environment. Yet here was evidence that he had been living alongside people whose lives were complete mysteries to him. Elena returned home that night to find her children unusually subdued. Mrs. Chun had spent the day explaining to them why they could never, under any circumstances, visit their mother's workplace. The elderly woman had been gentle but firm, helping them understand that some jobs required absolute rules that couldn't be bent or broken. Sophia listened to the explanation with the solemn attention of a child who sensed that something very important was being discussed. She promised to never leave Mrs. Chin's apartment again without permission, but her eyes held a sadness that broke Elena's heart. Sophia had seen something beautiful and magical, and now she was being told it was forever off limits. Miguel, ever practical, asked the questions that Sophia was too upset to voice. Why couldn't they visit their mother at work like other children? Why did Elena look so scared when they talked about her job? Why did everything about their mother's new position seem to be wrapped in secrecy? Elena found herself struggling to answer her son's questions without revealing her own fears and insecurities. How could she explain that they lived in a world where people like Marcus Wellington III existed in a completely different reality from families like theirs? How could she make a 6-year-old understand that their presence at the mansion could cost her the job that kept them fed and housed? That night, as Elena tucked her children into the bed, the following Monday brought an early winter storm that transformed the city into a maze of delayed buses and canceled meetings. Elena arrived at the mansion soaked and breathless, having run the last 3 blocks when her usual bus broke down in the flooding streets. She had left Sophia and Miguel with Mrs. Chun earlier than usual, but the elderly woman was fighting a cold and Elena worried about adding to her burden. Marcus noticed Elena's bedraggled appearance when she passed by the dining room window, though he pretended to be absorbed in his morning financial reports. There was something different about her today, a frazzled energy that contrasted with her usual composed efficiency. He found himself curious about what circumstances had led to her obvious distress. Elena threw herself into her work with desperate determination, trying to make up for her late arrival by working twice as fast as usual. She moved through the mansion like a whirlwind, cleaning and organizing with an intensity that spoke of deeper anxieties than simple job performance. What she didn't know was that Marcus had begun paying attention to these subtle changes in her behavior. The storm worsened throughout the morning, and by noon the city's public transportation system had essentially shut down. Elena received a call from Mrs. Chun explaining that she needed to pick up the children early. The elderly woman's cold had developed into something more serious, and she didn't want to risk exposing Sophia and Miguel to whatever she might be coming down with. Elena stared at her phone in panic. She had no way to reach Mrs. Chin's apartment and returned to work before Marcus noticed her absence. Her neighbor lived across the city, and with the buses not running, a taxi would cost nearly a full day's wages. But she couldn't leave 2 6-year-old children alone with a sick elderly woman, especially when Mrs. Chun was too unwell to provide proper supervision. Making a decision that terrified her, Elena called Mrs. Chun back and asked if she could bring the children to her workplace just for the afternoon. She explained that she would keep them completely out of sight, that they would stay in the service areas where no one would see them. Mrs. Chun, too sick to argue and worried about exposing the children to her illness, reluctantly agreed. Elena arranged for Mrs. Chin's nephew to drive Sophia and Miguel to the mansion, meeting them at the service entrance where deliveries were made. She had calculated that Marcus would be in his study for the entire afternoon, working on a presentation for the following day's board meeting. If she could keep the children quiet and contained in the small staff break room near the kitchen, they might be able to remain undetected until she could find another solution. Sophia and Miguel arrived wide-eyed and amazed at their first glimpse of the mansion's exterior. Even in the storm, the building was imposing and beautiful, its modern lines and expensive materials speaking of a wealth they had never encountered. Elena hurried them inside through the service entrance, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she was risking everything. The staff break room was small but comfortable, with a kitchenette, a table, and a few chairs arranged around a television that was rarely used. Elena settled her children at the table with coloring books and snacks, explaining in whispered tones that they needed to be absolutely silent. This was a game, she told them, where the goal was to be invisible and quiet as mice. Sophia, still enchanted by memories of her previous adventure, was fascinated by this new glimpse into her mother's world. Everything seemed so clean and perfect compared to their cramped apartment, and she couldn't understand why they needed to hide in this small room when the rest of the house was so beautiful. Miguel, ever practical, sensed his mother's fear and appointed himself as Sophia's guardian, promising to keep his sister quiet and still. For 2 hours, Elena's plan worked perfectly. She was able to complete most of her afternoon tasks while checking on the children every 15 minutes. They remained in the break room, entertaining themselves with the activities she had provided and whispering quiet conversations about the grand house around them. Elena began to hope that she could get them through the rest of the day without incident. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling with his own crisis. The presentation he was preparing was for a crucial board meeting that would determine the future direction of his company's charitable foundation. For years, the Wellington Foundation had focused primarily on tech education and business development, but recent pressure from stakeholders was pushing for more diverse community involvement. As he reviewed proposals for new charitable initiatives, Marcus found his attention wandering to thoughts of children and families in need. Images from the security footage kept intruding on his concentration, the small figure exploring his property with such innocent wonder. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus was confronting the reality that his wealth and privilege existed alongside genuine hardship and struggle. The storm knocked out power to several sections of the city, and Marcus received word that the afternoon's scheduled conference call had been canceled. This left him with an unexpected break in his routine, and he decided to walk through the house to clear his mind. His steps carried him away from his usual path, toward areas of the mansion he rarely visited during working hours. It was the sound that stopped him cold, a child's giggle, quickly shushed, coming from somewhere near the kitchen. Marcus froze in the hallway, certain he had imagined it. But then, he heard it again, unmistakably the sound of children trying to contain their amusement about something. Following the sound, Marcus approached the staff break room with the stealth of someone investigating a crime scene. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see Elena sitting at the table with 2 small children, all 3 of them huddled over what appeared to be coloring books. Elena was whispering instructions about staying quiet, while a little girl with dark curls nodded solemnly, and a serious-looking boy organized crayons with methodical precision. Marcus should have been furious. His absolute rule had been violated in the most blatant way possible. Instead, he found himself frozen in place, watching a scene that was both completely foreign and oddly compelling. Elena's gentle voice as she helped her daughter choose colors, the boy's careful attention to keeping the crayons properly sorted, the girl's obvious delight in the simple activity of drawing. It was a glimpse into a world Marcus had never experienced. As he watched, Sophia looked up from her coloring and whispered something to Elena about the beautiful house. Elena's response was soft but firm, explaining that they were guests who needed to be respectful and quiet. The interaction revealed a warmth and connection that Marcus had never seen in his own childhood, where conversations with adults had always been formal and distant. Miguel noticed his mother's tension and reached over to pat her hand reassuringly, a gesture so mature and caring from such a young child that Marcus felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. This little boy was clearly trying to take care of his mother, sensing her anxiety and attempting to provide comfort in the way that children do when they understand more about adult worries than they should. Marcus backed away from the door without revealing his presence, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. The logical part of his brain insisted that this situation required immediate action. Rules existed for good reasons, and allowing exceptions would only lead to chaos. But another part of him, a part he had thought was long dead, was moved by what he had witnessed. He returned to his study and tried to focus on his work, but concentration was impossible. The image of Elena with her children kept intruding on his thoughts, challenging every assumption he had made about his staff and their lives beyond his employment. For the first time, he was confronting the reality that the people who maintained his perfect world had complex lives and responsibilities of their own. Elena checked on her children again at 3 o'clock, bringing them juice boxes and crackers from the kitchen. Sophia was growing restless despite her promises to be good, and Miguel was struggling to keep his sister entertained in the small space. Elena realized that her plan was beginning to fall apart as the children's natural energy pressed against the constraints she had imposed. As Elena was whispering reassurances to her children, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Her heart stopped as she recognized the distinctive sound of Marcus's expensive Italian shoes against the marble floor. She pressed her finger to her lips, signaling Sophia and Miguel to remain absolutely silent, and held her breath as the footsteps paused outside the door. Marcus stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, his hand raised as if to knock on the door. Elena could see his shadow beneath the gap, and she was certain that her world was about to come crashing down. But, after a long moment, the shadow moved away, and the footsteps continued down the hall. Elena nearly collapsed with relief, but she knew that her time was running out. Marcus was clearly moving around the house more than usual, and it was only a matter of time before he discovered them. She needed to find a way to get Sophia and Miguel out of the mansion without being detected, but the storm was still raging, and transportation remained limited. As if reading her thoughts, Sophia whispered that she needed. Marcus rounded the corner expecting to confront an intruder, but what he found instead stopped him cold. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, her arms protectively wrapped around 2 small children who looked up at him with curious, unafraid eyes. The little girl had the same dark hair as Elena, while the boy bore a striking resemblance to his mother's determined expression. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one moved or spoke. Elena's face was pale with terror, but her stance was defiant, a mother prepared to face any consequence to protect her children. Sophia gazed up at Marcus with the frank appraisal of a 6-year-old, clearly trying to decide if he was a friend or a threat. Miguel stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Marcus and his sister with the protective instinct of a child who had learned early to be responsible. Marcus felt the angry words he had planned to speak die in his throat. These weren't random intruders who had violated his privacy. They were a family in crisis, and Elena's desperation was written clearly across her face. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus was confronted with the human cost of his rigid rules and isolated lifestyle. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. She explained about the storm, Mrs. Chin's illness, and her impossible choice between abandoning her children and risking her job. Her words tumbled over each other in a rush of apology and justification, but Marcus barely heard them. He was too focused on the children, who continued to watch him with that peculiar mixture of caution and curiosity that characterized the very young. Sophia, who had never learned proper fear of authority figures, stepped forward and extended a small hand toward Marcus. In her palm was a crayon drawing of a house that looked remarkably like his mansion, complete with gardens and a fountain. She explained in a sweet, clear voice that she had drawn him a picture of his beautiful castle, because castles should be full of happy people instead of being lonely. The simple gesture hit Marcus like a physical blow. This child had seen something in his life that he had refused to acknowledge, the emptiness beneath all his material success. Sophia's drawing showed his mansion surrounded by stick figures of people and animals, transforming his sterile sanctuary into something warm and alive. Miguel, sensing that something important was happening, spoke up for the first time. He told Marcus in careful, polite words that they were sorry for being in his house, but that their mother worked very hard and was a good person who took care of everyone. The boy's mature speech and serious demeanor revealed a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly, accepting responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. Marcus looked at Elena, seeing her clearly for the first time since she had started working for him. The fear in her eyes was mixed with fierce love for her children, and he realized that she had risked everything she had worked for to keep them safe. His anger began to transform into something more complex, a mixture of admiration, confusion, and a strange sense of recognition. Instead of the explosion Elena expected, Marcus did something that surprised everyone in the hallway, including himself. He knelt down to Sophia's eye level and accepted her drawing, studying it with the serious attention he usually reserved for financial reports. He told her that it was beautiful and that he had never seen his house drawn with so many happy people around it. Sophia beamed at the praise and immediately launched into an explanation of all the details in her picture. She pointed out the swing she had drawn in one of the trees, the sandbox she thought should be near the pool, and the flowers she had added everywhere because houses needed lots of color to be welcoming. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. Elena watched this interaction with amazement and growing hope. She had expected immediate termination and possibly legal consequences for her violation of the mansion's rules. Instead, she was witnessing the most powerful man she had ever met having a genuine conversation with her 6-year-old daughter about crayon art and playground equipment. Miguel, emboldened by his sister's success, asked Marcus if he lived in the big house all by himself. When Marcus confirmed that he did, Miguel's expression became deeply serious. He explained that living alone in such a big place must be very lonely, and that maybe Marcus needed a family to help fill up all the empty rooms. The child's logic was simple and devastating in its accuracy. Marcus found himself answering questions he had never been asked before. Sophia wanted to know if he had any toys, why all his rooms were so quiet, and whether he ever got scared at night in such a big house. Miguel asked more practical questions about whether Marcus knew how to cook for himself, who he talked to when he was sad, and why he didn't have any pictures of people in his beautiful home. As the conversation continued, Elena began to understand that something extraordinary was happening. Marcus was engaging with her children not as an employer dealing with a problem, but as a person who was genuinely curious about their perspectives. She had never seen him show interest in anything that wasn't directly related to business or maintaining his household routine. The storm outside intensified, making it clear that travel would be impossible for several more hours. Marcus made a decision that shocked Elena. He invited them to wait in the main living room instead of the cramped staff area, explaining that the children shouldn't be confined to such a small space when the rest of the house was empty and available. Elena hesitated, uncertain whether this kindness was genuine or a trap that would lead to even worse consequences. But Marcus's expression was open and sincere, and her children were already moving toward the beautiful room he had indicated. Reluctantly, she followed, preparing herself for whatever would come next. The living room was a masterpiece of modern design, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden and furniture that looked more like art than something meant for actual use. Sophia immediately went to the windows, pressing her nose against the glass to watch the storm, while Miguel examined the room with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how such luxury was possible. Marcus found himself explaining the features of the room, the fireplace that he never used, the piano that served as decoration since he had never learned to play, the expensive art pieces that he had purchased because his decorator recommended them. As he spoke, he began to see his possessions through the children's eyes, recognizing how cold and impersonal his beautiful home had become. Sophia asked if she could touch the piano, and when Marcus nodded, she climbed onto the bench and began pressing keys with the experimental joy of a child discovering music. The sounds she created were hardly melodic, but they filled the room with life in a way that Marcus had never experienced. Miguel joined his sister, and together they created a cacophonous symphony that should have irritated Marcus but instead made him laugh. Elena apologized for the noise, moving to quiet her children, but Marcus stopped her. He explained that the house had been silent for so long that he had forgotten what laughter sounded like within its walls. The admission surprised him. He had never acknowledged, even to himself, that the perfect quiet he maintained was more suffocating than peaceful. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself drawn into conversations and activities he had never imagined. Sophia insisted on showing him how to play simple games, while Miguel asked thoughtful questions about business and money that revealed a sharp intelligence and mature understanding of his family's circumstances. Elena watched in amazement as the reserved, intimidating man she worked for transformed into someone warm and approachable. Marcus learned that Elena's children were honor students despite their challenging circumstances, that Sophia dreamed of becoming an artist while Miguel hoped to study engineering, and that both children helped with household responsibilities far beyond their years. He began to understand the strength and sacrifice that had shaped this small family, and he felt a growing respect for Elena's determination to provide for her children. When evening arrived and the storm finally began to clear, Marcus made an offer that changed everything. Instead of firing Elena or pretending the day had never happened, he suggested that they continue their conversation over dinner. He explained that he had never shared a meal with guests in his home, but that the children had helped him see his house differently, and he wasn't ready for that new perspective to end. Elena was torn between gratitude and suspicion, unsure whether to trust this sudden kindness from a man she had never seen show interest in anything beyond business. But Sophia and Miguel were already chattering excitedly about the possibility of eating dinner in the beautiful dining room, and Elena realized that this might be the only chance her children would ever have to experience such luxury. Marcus instructed his chef to prepare a family meal. Instead, the weeks that followed transformed the mansion from a monument to solitude into something resembling a home. Elena's work schedule remained the same, but now Sophia and Miguel spent their after-school hours in the mansion's spacious rooms instead of cramped in Mrs. Chin's apartment. Marcus had converted one of his unused sitting rooms into a children's space, complete with desks for homework, bookshelves filled with educational materials, and art supplies that Sophia used with passionate creativity. The change was not without its challenges. Marcus had to learn to navigate the noise and unpredictability that came with having children in his carefully ordered environment. Sophia's exuberant personality meant that quiet afternoons were replaced with impromptu concerts on the piano, elaborate art projects that sometimes spilled beyond their designated areas, and endless questions about everything from the mansion's architecture to Marcus's business empire. Miguel, more reserved than his sister, appointed himself as the family's diplomatic liaison with their wealthy host. The boy seemed to understand intuitively that this arrangement was extraordinary and potentially fragile, so he worked hard to ensure that he and Sophia were model guests. He helped his sister clean up her projects, reminded her to use indoor voices, and often mediated between Sophia's enthusiastic chaos and Marcus's need for some semblance of order. Elena watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. She had never imagined that her children would have access to such opportunities, but she worried constantly about the sustainability of the arrangement. Marcus's kindness seemed genuine, but Elena's experience had taught her that circumstances could change without warning, and she lived in constant fear that one day the invitation would be withdrawn. Marcus found himself experiencing emotions he had forgotten existed. Sophia's artistic creations began appearing throughout the house, not because Elena placed them there, but because Marcus requested them. Her colorful drawings provided warmth to rooms that had previously felt like museum displays. Miguel's thoughtful questions challenged Marcus to think about his life and choices in ways that years of therapy and self-reflection had never achieved. The mansion's other staff members initially struggled to adapt to the new dynamic. Roberts, the longtime butler, was particularly concerned about maintaining proper household protocols when children were present. However, even he was eventually won over by Sophia's polite requests for help reaching high shelves and Miguel's genuine interest in learning about the mansion's history and operations. Chun, the head chef, discovered an unexpected joy in preparing meals that would appeal to young palates while still meeting Marcus's sophisticated tastes. The kitchen began to smell of homemade cookies and warm bread, aromas that had never existed in the mansion before but which Marcus found comforting in ways he couldn't explain. As winter deepened, Marcus began adjusting his schedule to spend more time with Elena's family. Board meetings were moved to accommodate homework help sessions, and business dinners were rescheduled so that he could be present for the children's bedtime stories. The changes were subtle but significant, representing a fundamental shift in Marcus's priorities. Elena noticed these adjustments and felt a growing sense of responsibility for the impact her family was having on Marcus's life. She tried to maintain professional boundaries, continuing to perform her housekeeping duties with the same efficiency she had always shown. But the traditional employer-employee relationship had evolved into something more complex, and both Elena and Marcus were navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. The transformation became most evident during the holiday season. Marcus had always treated Christmas as an inconvenience, a time when business slowed down and social obligations multiplied. He typically spent the holidays traveling to avoid the sentimentality and forced cheer that pervaded the city. But with Sophia and Miguel excited about their first real Christmas in years, Marcus found himself drawn into the celebration. Sophia's enthusiasm for holiday traditions was infectious. She convinced Marcus to help her decorate a Christmas tree, an activity he approached with the same methodical precision he applied to business negotiations. Miguel contributed practical suggestions about light placement and ornament distribution, while Elena watched in amazement as the mansion's formal living room was transformed into a warm, festive space. The decorating process revealed aspects of Marcus's personality that he rarely displayed. He was patient with Sophia's creative chaos, genuinely interested in Miguel's engineering approach to tree decoration, and surprisingly knowledgeable about holiday traditions from his own childhood. Elena began to see glimpses of the person Marcus might have been if his life had taken a different path. Christmas shopping presented new challenges and discoveries. Marcus had always delegated such tasks to assistants, but Sophia's insistence that gifts should be personally chosen led him to venture into stores and malls he had never experienced. Watching Sophia carefully consider what Miguel might like, and seeing Miguel's concern for finding something perfect for his sister and mother, taught Marcus about the thoughtfulness that made gifts meaningful. Elena worried about the expense and inequality of gift-giving between their families, but Marcus handled the situation with sensitivity that surprised her. His gifts to the children were thoughtful, but not ostentatious. Art supplies that Sophia had mentioned wanting, books that matched Miguel's interests, and experiences like museum memberships that would provide ongoing enrichment without creating embarrassment about monetary value. The Christmas morning celebration was unlike anything the mansion had ever witnessed. Sophia's excitement was boundless as she discovered her gifts, while Miguel's careful appreciation for each present revealed a maturity that touched Marcus deeply. Elena watched her children experience joy and abundance, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that their circumstances might permanently improve. Marcus observed the family's interactions with a mixture of wonder and recognition. The love between Elena and her children was evident in every gesture and word, creating an atmosphere of warmth that his money had never been able to purchase. He began to understand that his mansion's previous emptiness hadn't been the result of insufficient possessions, but of insufficient connections. The holiday season also brought new challenges to their unusual arrangement. Extended family members and business associates began asking questions about Marcus's changed schedule and priorities. Some expressed confusion about his newfound interest in domestic life, while others wondered about the appropriateness of his relationship with an employee and her children. Marcus found himself defending choices that he was still learning to understand. He explained to concerned board members that his personal life remained separate from business decisions, while privately acknowledging that Elena's family had influenced his perspective on the company's charitable foundations and community involvement initiatives. Elena faced her own social pressures. Neighbors and friends questioned the wisdom of allowing her children to become so attached to a lifestyle that might disappear at any moment. Some suggested that she was taking advantage of Marcus's temporary interest, while others worried that Sophia and Miguel would struggle to readjust to their previous circumstances if the arrangement ended. These external pressures forced Elena and Marcus to confront the undefined nature of their relationship. They were no longer simply employer and employee, but they weren't family either. The children had bridged the gap between their worlds, but the adults were still learning how to navigate the complex emotions and expectations that resulted. As winter turned to spring, the changes in Marcus's life became impossible to ignore or dismiss as temporary. He had begun sleeping better, laughing more frequently, and approaching business challenges with a creativity that surprised his colleagues. The mansion no longer felt like a sanctuary from the world, but rather like a foundation for engaging with it more meaningfully. Sophia's artistic talents continued to flourish under Marcus's encouragement. He arranged for her to receive proper art instruction, and her work began showing sophisticated understanding of color and composition. Miguel's intellectual curiosity found new outlets through educational programs and science camps that Marcus quietly funded, allowing the boy to explore his interests without burdening his mother financially. Elena's role in the household had evolved beyond housekeeping. Marcus increasingly sought her opinions on matters ranging from menu planning to charitable initiatives. Her practical wisdom and deep understanding of economic hardship provided perspectives that his privileged background had never offered. Elena found herself becoming a trusted advisor as well as an employee. The spring brought a crisis that tested the strength of their unconventional family bond. Marcus received a business opportunity that would require relocating to another city for at least 2 years. The offer was lucrative and professionally important, representing a chance to expand his empire and solidify his reputation in international markets. The decision forced Marcus to confront how dramatically his priorities had changed. A year earlier, he would have accepted such an opportunity without hesitation, viewing it as another step toward greater success and independence. Now, the thought of leaving Elena and her children felt like abandoning the most valuable discovery of his adult life. Elena learned about the opportunity accidentally, overhearing a phone conversation between Marcus and his business manager. Her first instinct was to prepare Sophia and Miguel for the inevitable end of their time in the mansion. She had always known that their situation was temporary, and she tried to frame Marcus's departure as a positive development for his career rather than a loss for their family. But Marcus's response surprised everyone, including himself. After weeks of consideration and consultation with advisors who couldn't understand his hesitation, he declined the opportunity. When Elena asked him about his decision, he explained simply that he had found something more valuable than professional advancement. He had found a family. The conversation that followed was transformative for both Elena and Marcus. For the first time, they acknowledged that their relationship had grown beyond the boundaries of employment into something deeper and more meaningful. They weren't romantic partners, but they had become partners in raising Sophia and Miguel, sharing responsibilities and joys that neither had expected to experience. Marcus formally asked Elena if she and her children would consider making the mansion their permanent home. The offer wasn't about charity or convenience. It was about creating a real family from the unlikely connections they had discovered. Elena's acceptance marked the beginning of a new chapter for all of them, one built on love, respect, and the understanding that family could be chosen as well as inherited. The mansion that had once been a monument to isolation became a testament to the power of opening one's heart to unexpected possibilities. Sophia's laughter echoed through halls that had known only silence. Miguel's questions challenged assumptions that had never been examined, and Elena's presence brought warmth to spaces that had been beautiful but cold. Marcus learned that true wealth lay not in possessions or power, but in the relationships that gave life meaning and purpose. Elena discovered that dreams could be realized in ways she had never imagined, and that love could transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. Together, they proved that family was not defined by blood or tradition, but by the choice to care for each other through all of life's challenges and celebrations. The mansion's rooms, once empty despite their luxury, were finally filled with the most precious things of all: love, laughter, and the promise of a future built together. Of his usual solitary dinner, and for the first time in 8 years, the mansion's formal dining room was filled with conversation and laughter. Sophia regaled them with stories about her school and friends, while Miguel asked Marcus serious questions about his work and whether being rich made him happy. As they ate, Marcus found himself sharing stories from his own childhood that he had never told anyone. He described the loneliness of growing up in boarding schools, the pressure of inheriting a business empire, and the gradual realization that success and happiness were not the same thing. Elena listened with growing understanding, recognizing that wealth had not protected Marcus from the same fundamental human needs that everyone shared. The evening revealed to Marcus how much he had been missing in his perfectly controlled life. The children's energy and curiosity awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, while Elena's strength and grace challenged his assumptions about the people who worked for him. For the first time, he began to question whether his rules and isolation were protecting him or imprisoning him. As the night drew to a close and Elena prepared to take her children home, Marcus made another decision that surprised everyone. He asked if Sophia and Miguel would like to visit again, explaining that the house felt different with people in it, and that he would welcome their company. The invitation was unprecedented, a complete reversal of everything Marcus had believed about his need for solitude and control. Elena looked at her children's excited faces and, then, at Marcus's hopeful expression, realizing that this day had changed all of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The barrier between their worlds had not just cracked, it had completely dissolved, revealing possibilities for connection and family that none of them had dared to imagine. To use the bathroom, Elena's heart sank as she realized she would have to risk moving the children through the main areas of the house. The staff restroom was located near Marcus's study, and there was no way to reach it without potentially crossing his path. Gathering her courage, Elena led her children quietly down the hallway, praying that Marcus would remain in his study. But, as they approached the bathroom, Sophia's curiosity got the better of her. She stopped in front of a large window that overlooked the mansion's formal garden, pressing her face against the glass in wonder at the view. Miguel tugged on his sister's arm, trying to pull her away from the window, but Sophia was transfixed by the sight of the storm lashing the perfectly manicured landscape. In her excitement, she forgot about the need for silence and exclaimed loudly about the beauty of the garden and the way the rain made everything look like a painting. The sound echoed through the quiet mansion like a bell, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Elena's face went white as she heard the immediate response, the squeak of a chair, and footsteps moving quickly toward the hallway. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. In seconds, Marcus would round the corner and discover them. Elena pulled her children close, preparing to face the consequences of her desperate decision. But, as Marcus's footsteps grew closer, Sophia looked up at her mother with complete trust and love, and Miguel squared his small shoulders as if preparing to protect his family. In that moment, Elena realized that whatever happened next, she had been fighting for something precious and worth any sacrifice. The footsteps stopped just around the corner, and Elena could hear Marcus's breathing as he prepared to confront the situation. The moment of discovery had arrived, and, with it, the collision of two worlds that were about to change each other forever. Paired in their tiny apartment, she made a silent promise to find a way to make their lives more stable. She had been surviving for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to hope for something better. But, seeing Sophia's wonder at the mansion's beauty, and Miguel's questions about fairness and opportunity, reminded her that her children deserved more than just survival. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his study late into the night, staring out at the pool area where the mysterious child had played. For the first time in years, his perfect sanctuary felt less like a refuge and more like a prison. The silence that he had always treasured now seemed oppressive, and he found himself wondering what it would be like to hear the sound of laughter echoing through his empty rooms. As the city lights twinkled below his windows, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of firing Elena or demanding explanations, he would wait and watch. Something about this situation had awakened a curiosity in him that he hadn't felt since his early days building his business empire. He wanted to understand what had driven a child to brave his security measures and explore his property. What Marcus couldn't yet admit to himself was that the child's presence had revealed a loneliness he had been denying for years. The mansion's perfect order and pristine silence had been his way of controlling a world that had felt chaotic and unpredictable during his childhood. But now, faced with evidence of a life beyond his carefully constructed walls, he was beginning to question whether control was worth the isolation it required. The next few days would bring new challenges and revelations that would force both Elena and Marcus to confront truths they had been avoiding. The barrier between their worlds had been cracked, and soon it would shatter completely, revealing possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine. She found her daughter asleep in the alcove, curled up like a kitten with her thumb in her mouth. Relief flooded through Elena as she gently woke Sophia and gathered her into her arms. Sophia was cold, but unharmed, and she looked up at her mother with wide eyes filled with wonder at the beautiful place she had discovered. Elena knew she needed to get Sophia off the property immediately, but as she carried her daughter toward the service entrance, she heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Marcus was returning from a late dinner meeting, and Elena realized with horror that they might be trapped. The main gates would open for his car, and the security lights would illuminate the entire front area of the estate. Thinking quickly, Elena carried Sophia to the pool house and waited for Marcus to enter the mansion. She could see lights coming on in his study, indicating that he was settling in for the evening. This gave her a small window to escape, but she would need to move carefully to avoid the motion sensors that would alert the security system. As Elena prepared to make her escape with Sophia, she had no idea that this moment would change everything for both her family and Marcus Wellington III. The carefully constructed walls that Marcus had built around his life were about to come crashing down, and the presence of two small children would challenge every belief he held about what he needed to be happy. Sophia stirred in her arms and looked up at the mansion's windows, where warm lights spilled out into the darkness. In her 6-year-old wisdom, she couldn't understand why such a beautiful place felt so empty and sad. She whispered to her mother about the lonely feeling that seemed to hang over the grand estate, and Elena realized that her daughter had sensed something that she herself had noticed but never put into words. The mansion that Marcus had designed as his perfect sanctuary was indeed lonely, though he had convinced himself that solitude was what he craved. Every pristine room, every silent hallway, every carefully controlled detail was part of a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt increasingly hollow within. As Elena finally managed to slip away with Sophia, carrying her sleeping daughter through the shadows and out to the street where a taxi waited, neither she nor Marcus knew that this was just the beginning of their story. The walls between their worlds had been breached, and what would follow would transform all of their lives in ways none of them could imagine. The next morning would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and the beginning of a connection that would force Marcus to confront everything he thought he knew about himself and what truly mattered in life. But, for now, Elena held her daughter close as they rode home through the empty streets, grateful that her secret was safe for at least one more night.